Good afternoon and welcome to this presentation on the 2020 Hayes Construction and NZIOB Salary Guide. My name is Malcolm Fleming, Chief Executive of the New Zealand Institute of Building. This year's survey marks the 17th edition rather, of the Hayes Construction and NZIOB Salary Guide. For it is a year like no other, given COVID-19. We therefore took the opportunity this year to add a series of questions that explore the strategic decisions that businesses were making in response to the pandemic. The findings are informative and will create a new baseline of data for future years. I will shortly pass over to Jeremy Cameron of Hayes, who will run through the findings of this year's survey, which will cover the new COVID-19 response section, along with the salary and industry trends material that we traditionally report on. Jeremy's presentation will take about 20 minutes. Following Jeremy will be a presentation by Shelley Eden. Shelley is a director at law firm Gaze Bird, and she leads their employment team. Her presentation focuses on the new triangular employment legislation that was implemented in June of this year. This new law affects companies that hire contract labour or temporary workers, which of course covers a good number of businesses within the construction industry. Shelley's presentation will also take about 20 minutes, after which I will rejoin the session around 12:50 p.m. and facilitate the questions that you have asked of both Jeremy and Shelley via the webinar's platform's Q&A function, which I encourage you to use. So before I pass over to Jeremy, I would like to make you aware of a significant NZIOB feature that occurs on Friday, the 30th of October. Our Built to Last conference occurs during the day of Friday, 30th of October, with in-person attendance at the quarters in Auckland, along with virtual attendance options. Built to Last speakers include a US-based construction company that KPMG profiled as a construction technology case study in 2019. We have a director of architectural practice, Make Architects. We have a US-based management consultants whose TED talk has been watched 22 million times. And we have a case study on the ultimate Built to Last project, the Scott-based redevelopment project. The second part of the double feature is our annual New Zealand Building Industry Awards, which occurs on the evening of Friday, the 30th of October. This event is held simultaneously across venues in Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch, all connected via a virtual platform. With an excess of 800 in-person attendees registered already, we're on target for a particularly big night. Additional information on the Built to Last and the 2020 New Zealand Building Industry Awards can be obtained via the NZIOB website. I will now hand over to Jeremy Cameron, who is the Section Manager of the Construction Division at Hayes. Jeremy is Wellington based, so he joins me here live in the NZIOB offices this morning. So welcome to you, Jeremy. So I'll slide out and Jeremy will slide on. There we go. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Malcolm. Just having a chat to the team here in the office actually. So we're here in HQ in Wellington, and this time 12 months ago I was actually presenting to an audience at the PwC building here in Wellington. So to think that we're what we've sort of had to put up with in the last 12 months and where we've come from now to here is quite extraordinary. And if someone had said that 12 months ago, you wouldn't have believed them. So look, firstly, thank you to all of you for joining us today. As Malcolm said, I work in the construction team here in Wellington. I specialise in construction across mid to senior level roles across Wellington, the central region, up to the Hawke's Bay. Hayes as a business covers the country, so we have offices in Auckland, Wellington, Tauranga, and Christchurch. So we cover the country. We've been producing our report now for 16 years. It's actually the 17th edition, I believe, as Malcolm said, and it continues to deliver a huge range of insights and offers a valuable benchmark tool for recruitment trends and salaries within the building industry. So in this guide, you're going to find typical salaries for construction professionals in 11 locations across New Zealand. And you'll be able to compare salaries by location, project size, and construction type. Today, I just really want to highlight and share with you some of the key insights from this year's guide. Just move on to the next slide. As I said, 17th edition of this of our collaboration. Just move on to the next slide there. So to begin with, in today's COVID-19 context, one of the main findings will no doubt be unsurprising to many. Employers have reduced their salary increase intentions for this year. So according to our survey, when they last reviewed salaries, 23% of employers gave no increases. When they next review salaries, a much higher 37% intend to give no increases whatsoever to their staff. And while 39% of employers have increased their salaries by up to 3% when they last reviewed them, just 26% intend to increase at this level when they next review. And as you'll see there from the slide, the trend is similar at the 3 to 5% salary increase level. You'll see there 28% of employers increased at this level in their last review. Just 13% will do so when they next. And finally, while 10% increased their salaries above 5% when they last reviewed, only 5% will do so in the next review. So what can we take from this? Far fewer construction industry professionals will receive a salary increase this year compared to last. And for those who are lucky enough to receive a raise, this will be a much more moderate increase than in recent years. Now, this deliberate salary restraint is not necessarily new to the industry. Over the last few years, we've spoken of how ongoing, sorry, just go back a slide there. My slide master, thank you. Over the last few years, we've spoken of how ongoing margin pressure made it difficult for companies to increase salaries. So the prevailing trend for some time has been for employers to increase salaries by less than 3%. So salary stability is certainly something that the industry's skilled professional workforce is used to. But add the recent pandemic, and it seems that employers have become even more conservative in their salary increase intentions. Look, how long does this remain to be seen? We don't know, but what is clear is that there will come a point, whether it's in the next 6 months or the next 2 years, where salary pressure will mount and employees will look to be rewarded. If we move on to the next slide, obviously salaries are not the only area to be impacted by COVID. We also asked employers across our survey if the impact of COVID-19 would increase their company's workload in certain areas. And again, as you can see there from the slides, 42% said commercial workloads will increase. A further 42% indicated residential projects will increase, 35% infrastructure, while 26% believe that industrial projects would increase. Interestingly, over half, 56%, said COVID-19 would impact the composition of their company's private versus government work over the year ahead. So, and of those, 91% actually expect to see an increase in government work and a decrease from their private clients. Furthermore to the slide, 39% said that they had increased their investment in staff wellbeing. So staff wellbeing policies, strategies, etc., in response to COVID. And look, this is obviously a positive sign and something that we hope will be a lasting trend. Moving on, employers also indicated that they are prioritising new soft skills. Look, soft skills, we've seen a trend here for over the last few years, for sure. Communication skills there, as you can see, remains vital. For 48% said that they are now 48% said they are now also prioritising adaptability. So not surprising when regardless of role, I think in this current environment, employees are now required to be able to deal with workplace changes positively, but also be able to pivot effectively to ensure that the job is getting done. Just looking further at some of the soft skills there, critical thinking, obviously, attention to detail, collaboration, dependability. Interestingly, what's not on that survey, but maybe of interest to some, is that while 12% of our survey respondents said that their marketing increase had actually increased, a further 29% said that it had significantly decreased. So there's probably no major surprises there. Hey, some positive news. Let's be positive. Over half, 53% of people surveyed across the country believe that New Zealand's construction sector is better positioned than most others to be able to cope with the issues around post-COVID-19. Okay, moving on. Perhaps this optimism is born from the 38% of employers who said that their business activity had increased over the past 12 months. You can see there just ahead of the 36% who said it had decreased. Further 26% has remained the same, which I guess suggests that the construction sector as a whole has experienced some good levels of stability and even opportunities for close to 6 in 10 employers over the past year, judging by those figures. So given this, we can understand why 28% of employers said that they expect to increase permanent headcount over the coming year, slightly above the 26% who said that they are intending to decrease permanent staff levels, and 30% will keep them at the current levels. The contract space has been a really interesting one for us, and something that's been quite noticeable during and post-COVID for us as recruiters. 34% there, you can see, will increase their use of contract staff in the next 12 months. This is actually up from last year, which was sitting at about 30%. So certainly a shift north, and more than the 17% who say that they will decrease their use of contract staff this year. Well, our results basically here are showing that employers are using contract staff for both management and labour positions. Obviously, the market in New Zealand has always been quite prevalent in that labour space, but we are, again, as an agency, starting to see more of our clients open to the idea of bringing on senior construction professionals for that contract space. So it's probably quite a marked shift in the market. And look at understandable, I guess, if you think about where we are now. It's something that can offer headcount flexibility, while at the same time allowing companies, organisations to remain to be able to pivot and remain competitive. And as an aside, and probably good news for the recruitment industry, employers surveyed said that they who intend to recruit staff this year, 75% said that they'll use a recruitment agency. So happy days for some. Last year, I in person, unfortunately, I spoke to you about how New Zealand is suffering from an acute skilled labour shortage. For those who attended the function here last year, it was quite it was a major issue for the industry, big challenge facing the whole sector. Look, this skill gap still remains in place. COVID certainly hasn't been able to ease the skill shortages in that area. In fact, we've seen sort of an increase in some areas also, and hard to fill highly skilled roles. So 18% of employers have said that skills shortages will not have an impact on the effective operation of their business or department. So pretty low. 82% of employers have said that the skill shortages will have either a significant or a minor impact on their business. So it's clearly an issue that's facing the industry as a whole. Look, again, as an agency, we're seeing a lot of people returning from overseas, which is fantastic. And the pool of local and experienced candidates, Kiwis, is increasing, but it's not filling the gap that was there when the borders were open. So look, another key challenge that employees are going to face for the year ahead. And you can see there on the right hand side, look, no surprises here whatsoever, that the hard to fill roles, anyone, site manager, PM, estimators, QSs, tough to find in this market. It's very, very candidate short. Yeah, and look, we're sort of talking to a lot of employers at the moment. What a lot of employers are telling us is that they're being a little more flexible. Obviously, the contract staff is something that they're looking at, but also I think they're looking at transferable skills in some areas. Someone with a residential background hasn't necessarily worked in the commercial space, but what are those transferable skills are you able to bring across to sort of fill some of those shortfalls? Moving on, other end of the scale, like 91% of employers say it's easy or manageable to recruit cadets and entry-level candidates. Leading hands, 4 persons, health and safety site engineers, carpenters, highly skilled carpenters remain very, very scarce in this market. I don't think that's that's something that's new, obviously, but yeah, I mean the grad space is not surprising. A lot of our clients now have very good relationships with the universities and the leading technical colleges. A lot of networking events in place. I know the NZIOB have a lot of people as members in that space as well. I've met a lot of grads and cadets at their events. So that's how a lot of our grads are securing their next role. If we can move on, skills that employers foresee as having the greatest impact on their organisation. You can see there, communication skills has topped the list. Pleased to see, actually. And yeah, look, 85% of employers indicate that this is a soft skill that has the highest impact on their business. 67% their technical skills and organisational skills. Third most valued, selected by 59% of survey respondents. Just on that slide, so I think what this illustrates is the critical role that soft skills play in today's construction sector. These days we see it day in, day out, and I see it day out in my role. More employers have experienced the situation where a candidate, or it looks amazing on paper, and they possess the strong sort of technical skills to do the job, but they're unable to form the relationships when it actually comes to being on site or internally. So as a result, we're seeing firsthand that employers are placing a lot more emphasis on soft skills when they look to recruit their next hire. So given the skills shortage, the ability to attract and retain top talent obviously remains an important consideration for employers. As we all know, a successful attraction and retention strategy involves more than simply offering a market-aligned salary. Benefits have and always will play an important part in attraction and retention. And according to our findings on this survey, across all roles, the most popular benefits offered, you can see there, mobile phone, followed by vehicle, health insurance, and a bonus. Now, a breakdown of the typical benefits by role can actually be found on page 11 of the guide, which will be very soon be able to be downloaded for you. Yeah, in summation, it shows that bonuses are, well, it probably shows that there's varying degrees of what a benefit is to certain levels of employee. But again, page 11 of our guide will provide a breakdown to all the benefits there. Okay, so moving on. This year we asked employers if they offer flexible working practices. And if so, what they offer. So a significant 83% of employers said that they offer their staff flexible working hours. So I guess with so many employers offering flexible working hours to their staff, it's now seen as a norm across the industry, if you like. So, given this, if an employer is not offering staff flexible working hours, but they're potentially going to find issues around their attraction or retention. So I guess the advice there would be for such employers, it's advisable to look at how can they implement this practice within their workplace, to ensure that they are securing and retaining the top talent in the markets. And just on that, 54% of employers also said that they offer flexible leave options. Again, something that's sort of been introduced in the last few years. 36% offering flex place, and even 35% are offering part-time employment. So there are different options there as an employer for you to consider for your staff. So along with highlighting your flexible work practices when you're a next recruit, it's also important to indicate to candidates that you have a strong pipeline of work. So when we asked our survey respondents to think about what is important for them in terms of their career, you can see there that 84% said being employed by a company, construction firm with a pipeline of work ahead of it stood out amongst the rest. Followed by job retention, 60%, flexible working, which we've touched on, 48%, and support from their boss, crucial, 42%. Upskilling and more challenging, exciting work were also important, 31%. Interestingly, not on that slide there, just 31% said that a pay rise was important for them. So I think that's something to really think about again as an employer. Tough market conditions. What else can we offer our staff or potential, attracting talent that's not necessarily increasing the salaries or package. Other findings that we've found across our survey, look, gender diversity continues to be a huge area of focus for the industry. Look, we were a little surprised, to be honest, that despite continued efforts to improve diversity at the management level across all of corporate New Zealand, not just the construction sector, our survey results have actually indicated that not only has no progress been made, but the percentage of women in management roles has actually decreased slightly year on year. So, looking back to last year, 19% of management roles in the construction industry were filled by women. This year, the figures fallen to 18%. So, clearly a lot more work to be done there. However, we should point out that, as a recruiter, and I know my peers across Hayes and that recruit in this space, certainly seeing more and more female candidates in the market, particularly in the quantity surveying and the estimating space, and also very prevalent in the architecture design spaces as well. So, if this trend continues, which we will hope it will, it's certainly going to help improve the gender diversity. But look, just on that, I guess it's important for employees to commit to a diversity policy, hold staff accountable, and ensure that your entire employee population is on board when it comes to equality, diversity, and inclusion. Okay, if we can turn to the typical working week, just on the next slide there, if you can. Turning to the typical week, 80% of survey respondents said that people in their organisation usually work between 40 and 49 hours per week. So it's actually up 10% on last year. Again, looking there, interestingly, fewer people are working less than 40 hours. So that's 5% this year. I think it was 7% last year. The number of people working longer hours, longer working weeks of between 50 and 59 hours has actually fallen. So it's from 20% down to 12% the last year. So I'm sure that COVID's probably been a factor in there as well. But look, there's no question, work-life balance it plays a really important role in candidate attraction and retention. While it's obviously a bit of a challenge for the construction industry to achieve, I think looking at the overall numbers of hours your staff work each week is probably a good starting place, and that's certainly going to grow your reputation in the market as I suppose an employer that genuinely takes steps to look after their employees in this area. Okay, so we also asked our respondents about their employees' length of service. So just over half, or 53%, indicated that the average length of service of their employees is between 3 to 5 years. While for 32%, the average is 6 to 10 years. The latter there actually is an increase on last year's 27%, which is interesting. So that's probably indicating that long-term tenure is increasing, and I guess not surprising is, in these interesting times that people are looking for a little more stability and longevity. So before I finish, I'd like to add that it's obviously important to keep the current market trends in perspective. Things will recover in time. While we can't predict exactly when this recovery will come or how fast it will happen, today's uncertainty will eventually pass. It's not going to be tomorrow, and it might not even be next year, but it's going to pass at some stage. Look, and until then, there are a few things to probably keep in mind. I think firstly, organisations can continue to turn to temporary and contract staff to manage short-term workload requirements or shorter-term projects, even fixed-term work, which we haven't really talked about. Secondly, don't forget about continuous development opportunities for your staff. Look, this could be in the form of ongoing learning and development programs or career progression opportunities, or both. And in fact, with budgets remaining tight as they are at the moment, and salaries best described as restrained if offered at increases, if offered at all, staff can be rewarded through a promotion opportunity or ongoing training and development. And I can tell you firsthand that certainly such opportunities are important for candidates in this market and certainly cited as one of the main reasons they decide to look for a new role. Along with offering important attraction and retention benefits, obviously promotional development opportunities can also be utilised. Particularly important, I guess, at the moment, people are putting in long hours in these unprecedented times, and a lack of financial reward can potentially create engagement risk with employees. So, sort of thinking outside the box a little bit more about how you can reward and promote your staff is certainly going to be beneficial. And probably just finally, don't forget recognition. It can go a long way, and it allows you to, whether it's a thank you or however you choose to do it, it's something that acknowledges good results and behaviours. Again, when budgets are tight, we need to think a little bit differently. And there's a number of different ways that you can go to recognise your employees based on your organisation. So to conclude, I'd once again just like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found our presentation useful. This is really just a snapshot of the guide. The guide is now, or very soon, will be able to be downloaded from the Hayes website. So, don't be shy in reaching out if you want further information. My contact details I'll ensure get passed on. And we have Hayes officers around the country who are very well networked and equipped to be able to assist with your recruitment requirements in your respective areas. Good luck for the next year. it's going to be interesting to see where we are when we come around to doing this, the 18th edition, Malcolm. And look, any information on the market, trends, salaries, etc., reach out to your local Hayes office or myself, and we'll be more than happy to assist you with that. So without further ado, I think I saw a number of questions popping up there, which we're going to take at the end. I'm going to pass over to Shelley Eden. Shelley's delighted to have her on board today, the director at Gaze Burt, and she's going to talk through the new triangular employment legislation. But thank you very much for your time. I look forward to seeing you all again soon in person, hopefully.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much for passing over to me, Jeremy. I'm sitting here in the office in Auckland under the last day of 2.5 of the lockdown, wishing I was working in another part of the country, if I'm completely honest. And I just absolutely was fascinated by that presentation and where things have moved in the last 12 months, especially with the survey within the industry. I'm an employment lawyer. I'm the employment law director here at Gaze Burt, and obviously I see the implications and the impacts of things like the pandemic and upturns in different industries and so on and so forth. And it's particularly timely then to be tagging this part of the presentation on to Jeremy's presentation. The two topics at first appear a little bit unrelated, but when you actually look at that data and see that in fact what's happening in New Zealand is an uptake in the industry and contract workers and temp workers, you can understand why this particular piece of legislation is of interest to the industry, both from the agency perspective and from the client perspective. So we're going to talk about triangular employment relationships. Now, that may be a phrase that you've never heard before or never really thought about before. Essentially, what it means is that you have an employment relationship where you have three parties. So you have an agency, a temping agency, someone like Hayes, for instance, but of course there's tons of others, especially in your industry, there's a load of them. And you have a client, and the client in this case is the construction business, and you have the worker who is employed by the agency most probably. Now, when we looked at those stats, obviously it's contract workers as well as temp workers, but actually temp workers are used a lot in the construction industry, and it is in fact partly because of that and the use of migrant workers that this legislation came into force, because there's a fear that those workers can be readily exploited by unscrupulous operators or just actually kind of mistreated even by good guys, frankly. And so the government a couple of years ago put this legislation forward. Interestingly enough, the pandemic didn't stop it being put into force. It wasn't considered something that should be prevented. I suspect that these are times that those protections for workers, whilst sometimes difficult for employers to manage in terms of compliance costs and that side of thing, was actually seen as advantageous to the workforce. And I suspect when we look at the data that you've just seen, that is actually the case and probably quite justifiable. So it came into force in June this year. And as you'll see from the slide, it applies to those triangular relationships, where in effect there's three parties, as I've said, employer, worker, but also the agency, who actually is the actual employer rather than the end user, I suppose you could say, of the workers' services. So if you have that those agency personnel on site, there's now obligations to you as the client of the agency in terms of how you can be brought into personal grievance claims against by those employees in particular. So that's why it's important. I'll just go to the next slide if I could. Thanks, Hannah. Thank you. If you work with those labour hire or temping agencies, normally you don't have this problem. You don't have an issue with being brought into a grievance. And of course, that's the advantage of why you use them, right? You can bring in staff from Allied or whoever and use them for whenever you need them. And if you don't like them for some reason, you can get rid of them. You can literally call up the agency and say, get rid of this person. I don't like them anymore. I don't want them. Their work ethic's not good enough or whatever. And usually there's no comeback, or hitherto anyway, there was no comeback. And I, having acted for a couple of agencies over many years, it sometimes places the agency, this is less your concern, of course, those of you watching, but it sometimes places the agency in a really difficult situation. If a person's been removed from a site, sure, if we've got somewhere else to provide them work, then it's fine. But if we don't, then what happens? And can that person bring a claim against us? And there's a series of cases where employees have tried to make the end user client responsible for what's happened to them, because they're the one that has actually kicked them off site, right? And they've been mostly unsuccessful because actually the employer is the agency, it is not the end user client. Well, now, unfortunately for end user clients, what you are now probably is a controlling third party. So I'm describing that as end user client. Commercial party is, you know, sometimes how they're described, but essentially it's you, the construction company or the business. And so you're probably what's called a controlling third party. And what that is it's where you have engaged the provision of labour. So you've engaged an agency or third party for the provision of labour, and you exercise control over the work of the employee, which makes you kind of look like an employer. So you supervise, you direct. It's not intended to be the case where you get like an IT professional in who comes in through a company and works on site and manages your IT services, but you don't direct their work. It's meant for when you have someone on site who you're actually directing, your supervisors are directing that person in terms of where to go and what to do during the course of the contract. And if you are that person, then you become a controlling third party. And so if that contract worker, labour hire person, temp employee considers they've been unfairly treated, they can hold you liable for a share of their claim, essentially, and bring a personal grievance against you as well as against their agency. So we'll just move to the next slide. So how it works is that ultimately what it means is that an employee with a grievance can join the controlling third party to the claim. And the Employment Relations Authority, which is the court that deals with these things, will proportion compensation based on blame, essentially. So you can foresee a circumstance where the blame might actually be 100% or 90% with the client, with the controlling entity. Or conversely, the agency might have stuffed up how they did things, and they may have, bear the lion's proportion of the compensation. What it means in practice is there's some time periods in the legislation. And so if an employee, you may know this already, but if an employee wishes to raise a personal grievance claim against an employer, they have 90 days within which to do that. So the day you send someone away from the site or ask them to leave the office, possibly because you don't have work and are laying them off. And I think there's a really specific concern here around redundancy and how that is dealt with these with contract workers. But the day that happens, that person has 90 days to raise a grievance. As I've said already, hitherto that would have just been against the agency that employs them. Now what they can do is they can either raise it against you at the same time, or interestingly, and I've been thinking about the implications of this, but interestingly, the agency could bring you in and say, well, hang on a second, yes, we've got this personal grievance that's been raised against us because we've had to let this person go because they got kicked off site, but actually, it wasn't our fault. It was the construction site that is to blame, and we're going to bring them in. I suspect that will get used very infrequently. It would be a bold agency who joined one of their commercial clients, especially a really important commercial client or business partner, into a grievance claim by one of their employees. And as I say, I've been thinking through some of the consequences of this in terms of contractual, what your contract is with clients, what your contract is with the agency, whether you can exclude liability on that kind of thing. And so I think there's still some issues to be worked out with this legislation. Probably some cases have to be heard to give us some understanding of how it's going to be implemented and carried out. But in any event, either way, you can end up brought into this grievance claim. And essentially what's going to happen is that you'll then get called to attend mediation, and for those of you who understand the grievance process, then you'll know how that plays out, except surprisingly now it's for your temp workforce, not just your regular permanent workforce. And so again, I've given some thought, and I will have that next slide now, thanks Hannah. I've given some thought to, what does this mean in practice? Like, it's all very well to say that this is the law, but how should you handle temp workers? Does this suddenly change everything that you have to do? I think the short answer, it doesn't. It doesn't change everything, but it does mean that if you are having a problem with your labour hire or your temp staff, I think what it means you need to do is just not act rashly. I have had, as I said, I've worked for some agencies before, and they get the situation where they have a big cluster of workforce, perhaps on site at one client, and the client rings up and says that we just don't need those people anymore. And then the agency is left with a situation of, well, how do I deal with that? you know, it leads to redundancies and just all sorts of somewhat complex things sometimes, especially if there's not good communication between the client and the agency as to what the issues are and why this action's been carried out. And so I think in practice what that means is you just don't act rashly, don't act with haste, but actually work with the agency. And I think there's a real opportunity here. You know, you've got good relationships hopefully with your agencies. You can talk about issues and you can work on a plan for how you're going to deal with these types of issues if and when they arise. So work with the agency and use their processes, because there's an interesting little fish hook here. Which is that you don't want to act like you are the employer, because you're not the employer. And that's the whole point of bringing in a nice flexible workforce. That's the whole point in deciding to have contract workers, is to get that level of flexibility. So don't treat them like your employee, like they're your employee. They're not your employee. You don't want to treat them as if they are. But what you do want to do, I think, is engage with the agency, utilizing their processes. So if you are working with someone like Hayes, which is a good operator, and you know has good systems and processes, well then you'll be able to comfortably do that. And I think there will be a challenge on agencies as to how they manage this side of their business. And you know, if there are agencies out there that don't handle things properly, well, they might drift away or find they have to improve things. So I think there's a real challenge on both parties in some ways to grapple with this and the implications of this. And when I say engage with them in their processes, so what that means is that if it's not working out with the employee, if there's an incident of misconduct, probably what you're going to need to do is deliver to the agency the information that they need to then, say, dismiss that employee. So a good example would be an instance of discovering that someone is stealing equipment off the site or stealing materials or something like that. Like, it's a pretty cut and dried situation in terms of a dismissal. Ordinarily, you would just pick up the phone and say, I've caught this, he's not welcome. Don't send him or her back. And that's end of story. I think in this case, what you would need to do probably is gather up the information, the CCTV footage, or just whatever it is, the evidence you have, deliver it to the agency and let's say, look, this is the reason why we don't want this person back. And now we'll work with you to help you go through the processes to exit that person. And then, of course, if you both do that and act reasonably, then you're going to be resistant to any grievance claims. But it's going to be really interesting. One of the things I do a lot, as you can imagine, is I go to mediations with clients. And a mediation is usually between an employer and an employee. Those of you who have been there will know exactly what I mean. But you're trying to resolve the grievance. I've been to mediations before where there's three parties for various reasons. What this is going to lead to is more mediations with three parties. They have their own dynamic. It takes longer, and it's a different process because, of course, at mediation, what you're going to be asked to be doing is to be apportioning liability between the agency and the client for that employee's grievance, if indeed they have a grievance. So do you work together, or do you actually not work together and try and blame each other? And again, it's going to be a really brave agency that decides to blame its client for the actions of the client. But it puts the commercial relationship at risk. And as I've said at that last bullet point, act reasonably, but not as if the person's your employee. So when I say reasonably, gather the evidence, make sure you're not just getting rid of someone for no reason. I think there's an interesting, issue that then arises as well as to, is it a good idea to have to use temp staff, to use agency staff? And the answer, I think, is still going to be, of course it is. It does give you the flexibility. It does give you the ability to access, skilled staff in times, as we've seen from the survey, where there's skill shortages and they're likely to continue. I think that's the reality. And so, of course, it's going to be good to still use them. The benefits are still going to be there. But that key benefit that is sometimes quite important to people of not having to worry about the grievance side of things won't be present, and that's going to have to sort of be grappled with a little bit. It's interesting listening to the survey and the discussion there about the need to retain all industries have this right at the moment, but how do we retain staff, especially in circumstances where we're not going to be offering them more money, and how do we look at that? And so the way you treat your temps is probably, if you're a good organisation, you're going to want to treat them reasonably because you'll get the best work out of them and all the usual kind of benefits of actually being a reasonable employer. And in this case, being a reasonable employer will also protect you against liability. There's no case law on this legislation yet, and there probably isn't going to be for a little while. These things take a little while to get through the courts often, for there to be a suitable claim that someone decides to pursue and take to that point. And there does need to be case law on how to interpret the legislation and on how it's all going to pan out for people and how it's going to work out. But I think in principle, what I'm interested in at the moment is people who use labour hire bureaus, temp agencies, understanding that this exists and that actually they do have a liability potential and a potential responsibility here, and so need to be cognizant of that and put it into their processes somehow. It's a self-serving thing when a lawyer says take advice, but actually I think this is one of those areas where you do need to take advice, much like redundancies, in the COVID environment. There's fishhooks at the moment in employment law, and some of us have started learning some stuff as we go along. And this is an example of that, where we'll have to pick through situations and work out the answers as we go along. And it's going to be super interesting to see how that liability is levied against the two parties. How do we decide, was the controlling party, should they pay 90%, should they pay 50%, the controlling entity, should the agency be responsible for more? So I've rattled through that reasonably quickly. I would welcome your questions if anyone wants to talk more about it, and otherwise I'm going to hand back to Malcolm and hope that I haven't caught him on the hop by being a little bit shorter in time. Malcolm.
Not at all, we're all organised here. Thank you, Shelley. Well done. Shall I just ask a couple of questions of you while we've just concluded your presentation, which we thank you for. How well known is this law? Like, to my mind, the media has been consumed with COVID-19. There hasn't been a lot of oxygen to anything else. Are employers aware of this?
Look, it's a really interesting question, Malcolm, and hence my comment that I'm trying, wanting to make people aware. Certainly, my clients haven't been. And it's been about, one of my jobs is to try and make my client base aware of legislation that impacts them. And so that's what I've done in relation to this. But it really has come in, it was passed on it came into force on the 27th of June this year, was passed on the 27th of June last year. So much has changed in that time that I don't think there is a focus on this at all. And I don't think people do know about it. And unfortunately, that means some people will get a bit burned by discovering that actually their decision to just send the person off site or send them away from the office has actually come back to bite them. So I think it is important to try and get the word out that there is, that this does exist. Short answer is I don't think people are that aware. I think we have had too much else happen this year, and this is just one of a myriad of things that are kind of going under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, like when Adam Shapley mentioned it to me a couple of months ago, I said, triangular, what are we talking about? So it was a good idea of Adam's to add this to the presentation. I was really interested in the commentary regarding what the agencies, it's a bit like any business. There are agencies which are large, have good resource, have policies and processes that can handle this and any issues that may arise, and then of course there are the smaller ones that perhaps don't. So perhaps, and you comment on that, so I'm just sort of circling back to that. Are you seeing from employers that they're starting to drill down and ask some tough questions of those they seek temporary or contract labour from? If there's something, an issue arises, what are your policies? Let me understand what they are so that I can have some comfort as an employer that if I are brought into a triangular law dispute, then you got my back.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good point. And, there's an interesting case in the employment court on a triangular situation where the judge said, essentially the agency was saying, well, our client wanted us to remove this person from their site. And so we had no choice but to do that. And our commercial arrangement allows them to do that. And the judge said, well, you just have to work with your clients, basically. And I read that decision and thought, this is why people sometimes get frustrated with the law and the courts, because it didn't bear any commercial reality. But I think the reality is now, because of this legislation, it will cause people to do exactly what you've said and go, well, what is it that happens? Where is your policy? What is the process? How do we engage with you on this? And business, the agencies that have good processes and policies will be able to go, no problem, here's what we've got, and be in a really strong position to work together.
So, Jeremy, if I could perhaps bring you into that conversation. I understand you're on this contract temp space personally, but in your team within Hayes, are the contract temps starting to see these questions being asked by employers?
Look, I guess they would be. I mean, I don't work in the, as you say, I don't work in the contract sort of temp space, so it doesn't impact me directly. But I know that certainly Hayes as a business, obviously Adam Shapley and the business are all over this and certainly taking it very seriously. So I'm sure these conversations are taking place. I'm not privy to what's going on, so I can't really comment to be honest. But look, I was like Malcolm as well. A few months ago, I'd sort of heard the phrase and was the same. So what are the government doing here to sort of get this out into the market as well? Are you getting a lot of support from the government, because it's obviously crucial policy that needs to be?
Yeah, look, I think NBIE are across it in terms of part of their education. It's posted on their website and that type of thing. But I haven't seen a lot of activity, if I'm completely honest. And I just think it's just part and parcel to do with the fact that at the moment so many people are distracted by what's going on in workplaces because of COVID. That this is, that we had all the wage subsidy stuff and we've got issues around redundancies, and I don't think this has been a particular focus. And I suppose at least part of that is because it affects a niche of well, I say a niche, it affects a niche of the workforce. I say a niche, but actually 1 in 10 employees are temp workers of some description, contract or temp workers. And so actually it's quite a large niche. And I think it is on the uptake. So I don't want to be critical about it. I just think it's sort of there for people, but because it is seen probably as impacting a fairly small number of players in the overall employment market, it doesn't seem to be getting a ton of attention.
Do you think it's going to impact on people's decision to want to take on temporary staff? A company's going to be a lot more reluctant to if they start to see some of these. Yeah,
look, I think it's possible. I think if you're looking, especially maybe if a company is at that point of, well, do I take on a temp worker, or actually shall I just hire myself? And I think it could have an influence once it becomes known. I think that influence will be better known once we get some case law and see how this actually lands. Because if the cases sort of settle down and say on the side of no, the agency is more responsible, because at the end of the day they control the employee primarily and they can have influence over the say the site or the employer, the controlling third party, then it might not be so bad. It'll be like, okay, well, this is no problem, doesn't really affect us. If habitually though those cases place real emphasis on the actions of the controlling third party for liability, then I would say that it would start to influence. You can imagine being a business, if you get a lot of labour hire workers in or temp workers in, and you get 3 claims suddenly and you get bang, 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 you sort of have to pay out in mediations, you might start thinking, maybe I'll just bring people into the fold. But I do think, as I said before, I do think on balance, there's still a lot of advantages in using a temp workforce, and I don't think this should stop people doing it. I just think they need to engage with the agency as to what their processes are to sort of deal with this and engage in that contractual level maybe, and try and push some of the liability aside a bit. I don't think that's possible to contract out of the Act, but it could be that you can apportion, you can just write into the contract these requirements to help out and work together. I think that would help both parties. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to get back to the actually Hayes Construction NZIOB salary guide. So the data that was collected through the survey is now a couple of months old. So are some of these things that you've been highlighting today, the focus on well-being policies, employers looking for the soft skills, particularly communication, leadership skills, are they flowing through? Are you seeing that from your employers and your candidates that you're seeing now in September, a couple of months later?
Yeah. Look, I think there's probably two sides to answer that. So if I can start from the candidate side, right? Candidates are looking for more than just a salary. So if you look around the market, salaries are fairly, don't differ too much between sort of main contractors and companies. So look, I might have a candidate that's got 4 or 5, 6 opportunities on the table that they're potentially looking at. The salary is going to be pretty much ballpark. It's what a company is offering outside of that is ultimately going to make the difference in terms of getting, being successful in hiring that person. So look, it comes down to, culture is massive. The right culture of an industry. Work-life balance is enormous. People want to have that flexibility in their lives. Obviously, these days we're seeing a lot more people working from home, etc. Not so prevalent in the construction industry. Obviously, when you need to be on site, but if you're a QS or an estimator, I think so candidates are certainly looking for those things. I think clients are definitely, the good clients get it. So they are offering, things outside of just an increase on the salary. So yeah, to answer your question, I don't think we haven't seen too much change. Obviously, salaries are going to be, we're not going to see the salary increases that we've seen perhaps in previous years. So I think what clients are doing is they are thinking outside the box and offering things outside of just an increase in salary.
One thing that came through quite strongly here was employees looking for a good line of sight of work from the employer. So are you saying on one side, you're asking employees or candidates actually asking that question, does this company that you're proposing to me, does it have a good pipeline?
Absolutely.
And conversely, are employers making sure, hey, Jeremy, you want to tell your candidates that we've got these projects lined up?
Huge selling point, massive selling point. So again, obviously, in the times that you are at the moment, stability, candidates are looking for stability and longevity. A good pipeline of work. We're seeing some of the main contractors with sort of 2-3 years of pipeline. It's a massive selling point to attract the best candidates. So yes, clients are certainly using it as a selling point. Candidates are definitely looking to that as a sign of real stability and longevity. So we're not seeing the move. We're not seeing the candidates sort of jumping from client to client. 2 years here, 2 years here. 10 years is going to go up. I think it's going to increase even further across the next sort of 2 or 3 years. We've seen there's already been a slight increase.
So there's probably an aspect of loyalty to this as well.
Definitely.
Particularly if employers have not had scaled their redundancy, scaled back their staff. There's an element of loyalty there. Keep you on going forward. Just in terms of the flexibility that you touched on before as well, we've got a question that just come in. How have others, presumably employers, fairly implemented flexi work policies for the build team?
How have others fairly implemented flexi work policies for the build team? That's a good question, actually. So I'm assuming that who is that anonymous attendee?
I can't help you with that because I'm not.
Look, I think, well, of course, it depends on the size of the company. Whether it's a size of the business and how many staff you have. Certainly, seeing companies, for example, who may work 6 days, have rostered systems. So we see a lot of that sort of stuff. We're definitely seeing a lot more of the professional employees from the commercial side, so your QSs and your estimators and people like that don't necessarily get to be on site every day, who have having the ability to be able to work remotely. Seeing a big increase there. I mean, it's hard when you're a site manager, right? You've got to be on site.
And that's why I think this question's a little.
Yeah. So look, that's a hard one. And in the construction sector, obviously that's always going to be a challenge, because if you're a site manager or a senior site manager or a foreman on site, it's pretty hard for you to be able to work remotely. So I think with those, it's very role dependent. I don't have an easy answer for that, to be fair, from the actual site-based guys. But look, certainly some of the other benefits that we've talked about will apply to those people.
Okay, we've only got a minute to run. One observation that I made in here is that 88% of companies are still having the current investment levels and things like technology either stay as they are, either not decreasing or they're actually increasing, which I think is a positive sign of companies investing in themselves going forward, and taking a long-term view. So that's a positive aspect that I took out of that. We should better wrap it up there so we can close it bang on 1 o'clock. So thank you very much to Jeremy Cameron from Hayes and from Shelley Eden from Gaze Burt. Thank you so much for both your contributions today, and we'll conclude there bang on 1 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.